Okay, first order of business. To the people who have already guessed what I'm talking about, I know that calling it a fake language isn't a fair characterization. Rest assured, I only use those words because I am at the mercy of a cruel and capricious algorithm. For the rest of you, I can guess what your question is. What exactly am I talking about? This is L.L. Zamenhof, a Polish gentleman, by modern borders anyway. He lived between the 19th and 20th centuries and grew up in the Jewish community of Białystok, a city and community that were both deeply multilingual, to the point where his initials LL stand for like 10 different things in 10 different languages. Growing up in that kind of environment would prove important because when he was in college, Zamenhof, as many college students do, developed a strong idealism. He believed that the root of all conflict and prejudice was that people often can't properly communicate with each other, and that to facilitate peace between peoples, it would be necessary to create a new international language from the ground up. Zamenhof called his language Esperanto. It wasn't the first constructed language, but it remains, to this day, the most popular. I've been learning Esperanto for a while now, and I've been playing fighting games on and off for as long as I can remember. It might seem odd, connecting a language designed to facilitate peace to a form of competition where imaginary people beat the snot out of each other, but in this video I'd like to explain how the two have become connected in my life, and why, while you probably don't need to literally learn Esperanto, having something like it in your life might be of some benefit to you. I'd like to preface this part of the video by saying two things. One, I'm not what anyone would call a polyglot. I took a year of German in college and have intermittently used it since, but I'm far from fluent. And two, if I was a polyglot, that may actually make me less likely to want to learn Esperanto. You see, it's pretty controversial in the language learning community. Different people raise different objections to it, of course, but no less than J.R.R. Tolkien put his pretty succinctly. Greek mythology depends far more on the marvelous aesthetic of its language and so of its nomenclature of persons and places, and less on its content than people realize, though of course it depends on both. And vice versa. Volapük, Esperanto, Edo, Novial, etc. are dead, far deader than ancient unused languages, because their authors never invented any Esperanto legends. Essentially, Esperanto was invented by one person rather than collectively by a culture, and that makes it inherently less appealing to polyglots who often learn languages for the sake of cultural exchange. Maybe if Zamenhof's whole world peace through a universal language plan had actually worked, things would be different, but, and you probably already know this, it didn't. So why did I get into it? Well, for one, I like how easy it is. The grammar rules are fairly intuitive, and each letter is pronounced one way and one way only. The sort of thing you get with a language designed from the ground up to be as accessible to as many people as possible. But honestly, the main reason I like it is the main reason some polyglots don't. That it has no culture, virtually no native speakers, and by extension, an ambiguous sense of what fluency actually is. And for me at least, I find that helpful. To explain why, let's compare it to the other language I've spent time learning. German, on a technical level, isn't super hard for an English speaker. The grammar has some nuances to it, and noun gender is always a pain, even for native speakers, but it's nothing too bad. But for me, there's one major obstacle. And it's this guy. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. If you're unfamiliar, he's often called the German Shakespeare, but that might be underselling him a little bit. I've read a little of his work, in English, almost exclusively, because the first time I tried to read him in his original language, I ended up completely demoralized. Obviously, it's completely irrational for me to believe that after a year of instruction in school and infrequent self-study since then, I would be able to read at the level of the greatest writer in the history of the language. Like, I should have stuck to graded readers for a while, or maybe one of the hundreds of crime novels written in German every year. Seriously, they love their crime fiction over there so much that it's frequently referenced in German textbooks. But I didn't want to read any of those, I wanted to read Goethe. And while my feelings when confronted with the fact that I wasn't ready were highly irrational, that's kinda how feelings inherently are. And I felt demoralized, to the point where I didn't pick up the language again for a little while. And here's the twist of the video, I guess. Learning Esperanto has actually brought me back to German a little bit. To explain why, let's talk about fighting games for a bit. That's probably why you're here, after all. Fighting games are hard. I think that's a fairly uncontroversial statement. After all, at the end of the day, learning a fighting game means learning hundreds, maybe even thousands of distinct responses for distinct situations. And I'm sure some of you already know the comparison I'm about to make, but that's kind of what learning a language is like. And sometimes you can run into the same kinds of obstacles. You may know the feeling. You get into a game, spend some time labbing it out, then you take it online and you get destroyed. Or maybe you don't get destroyed. Maybe you actually do pretty well, all things considered. So you keep playing and steadily improving. Then you realize that your game is going to be featured at an event, so you either give the stream a watch, or maybe you even go to the event in person if it's local to you. Maybe you play, maybe you don't. Regardless, at some point along the journey I've just described, one thing is inevitable. That you realize you have much more to learn. That's not always a bad thing. For some players, realizations like that are one of the main reasons they even play fighting games in the first place. And that's a broadly good mentality to have, I think. But often it's a mentality that has to be cultivated consciously. Otherwise, those moments can be demoralizing, sometimes enough to push people away from the game and even from fighting games as a whole. I mean, ask a friend of yours who has a knee-jerk negative reaction to fighting games why they feel that way, and while they may or may not admit it outright, you'll probably be able to tell that their negativity around fighters stems, at least in part, from a particularly demoralizing loss or series of losses, one that made the whole process of grinding out fighting games seem more trouble than it was worth. And don't get me wrong, I have no interest in mocking the normies who don't appreciate the genius of fighting games, because I think nearly all of us have felt that way at some point, even if it wasn't enough to make us quit. So how do we combat that feeling and cultivate a healthier mentality overall? Well, one solution, definitely not a cure-all, but potentially helpful, is to have an Esperanto of your own. And what do I mean by that? Well, in the simplest terms, I mean something fun to do that doesn't stress you out. I think it should probably be something you practice, something you improve at, but definitely something where you don't have an end goal in sight. Maybe something where there isn't one. Maybe fighting games themselves can be that for you, but maybe not. Theoretically, you'd be able to apply this mentality of self-improvement for its own sake to pretty much everything in your life, but that's a million times easier said than done. I myself have something I care about that I haven't ever been able to completely remove ambition from, that being my work as a filmmaker. Maybe someday I'll reach that level of enlightenment, but I'm nowhere near there yet. Still, in carving out places where I could work out a healthier vision of self-improvement, it's definitely helped my mentality elsewhere. And I hope, if you take this advice, that it helps you too. I know this isn't a very revolutionary idea. After all, I'm essentially just telling you to go find a hobby. But to paraphrase something I've said on this channel before, life has a way of getting in the way of us remembering things we've learned a long time ago. The hope is that in mapping out a specific way that I deal with these things, I can be of some use on that front. In any event, I hope you enjoyed the video. I don't usually do straight-up self-improvement things like this, but if you liked the weird comparison between video games and something completely different, I do tend to do that a lot, so give the rest of my channel a watch if you find that sort of thing interesting. Anyway, it feels weird to have a video about Esperanto without any actual Esperanto in it, so here goes. Dankon pro via spektado.